Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 293 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining me for this special cocktail futurism episode where we gaze into the still somewhat hazy future of the spirits and cocktail world to see where things might be headed. If you'd like to get a more general introduction to the topic of cocktail futurism, go ahead and check out episode 280, where I lay out the landscape in somewhat broader strokes. But that might not be entirely necessary, because our subject for this episode feels much more like the present than some far-off speculative future. Of course, I'm referring to artificial intelligence, AI, that buzzword that's dominating LinkedIn and which is something that you've probably at least played around with in the form of ChatGPT or some other large language model. If the tech articles in your newsfeed are to be believed, there's very few industries out there that won't be disrupted or revolutionized by artificial intelligence in the near future. And while it seems like the bar and cocktail world could be one of those rare exceptions, I think it's probably more prudent for us to ask, in what ways might AI transform how we create, enjoy, and perhaps even think about cocktails in the future? But before we start asking large language models to adapt the persona of Jerry Thomas and start cranking out blue blazers, let's take a brief pause so that you can make yourself a drink. In the spirit of this episode, I figured I'd let ChatGPT take the wheel and invent its very own holiday-themed cocktail. But I wanted to be a little silly about it, so I gave it the following prompt. Create an original cocktail inspired by the theme of the Krampus Christmas tradition. This might seem a little vague, but I wanted to give the AI some room to play. What it came up with is a little drink called Krampus's Coal Old Fashioned. ChatGPT said, here's an original cocktail inspired by the dark, festive, and mischievous Krampus Christmas tradition. It blends rich, warming, and slightly sinister flavors with a touch of holiday spice. To make this AI cocktail, you'll need 2 ounces of dark rum, 1/2 ounce Amaro, the examples given are Averna or Fernet Branca, 1/4 ounce blackstrap molasses syrup, 2 dashes smoked chili bitters, 1 dash orange bitters, a charred orange peel for garnish, and activated charcoal, which is optional, but for that dark black color. In a mixing glass, combine dark rum, Amaro, blackstrap molasses syrup, smoked chili bitters, and orange bitters. Add ice and stir until well chilled. Strain into a rocks glass over a large ice cube. Optionally, add a pinch of activated charcoal for a dark, inky effect, stirring gently to blend. And finally, express the oils from the charred orange peel over the glass and drop it in as a garnish. Now, there's a couple things to raise your eyebrow at here, right? It's not perfect. First off, 2 ounces of booze with 3/4 of an ounce of sweetened aromatized ingredients really makes this more of a Manhattan than an old-fashioned. Full stop. Serve it on the rocks if you want, but it's a Manhattan. The rum and the smoked chili bitters also seem somewhat out of place, considering that the Krampus is a traditional alpine figure from Bavaria, Austria, Italy, some parts of Eastern Europe. Ain't no sugar cane and chili peppers growing above the snow line. On the other hand, Germany does have a pretty interesting and long-standing rum culture, so I'll give it a pass on that front. And I was reasonably impressed with how the AI made connections between the sinister nature of the Krampus and certain flavors like chili, smoke, and bitter Amaro. Molasses and orange also happen to be pretty holiday-centric flavors, so when it comes to the thematic component of this drink, I think ChatGPT nailed it. Would I order this drink at a bar if I knew the full spec and ingredient ratios? Probably not. But if it had a slightly better name and ditched the activated charcoal, I could see myself giving it a whirl under the assumption that a real live bartender had dialed in the flavor profile. So, now that you've got just the slightest taste of what our AI overlords can do with a dataset that includes most of the cocktail books written in the last 150 years, let's dive straight into part 1 of our 2-part AI cocktail investigation. As with any topic, if you're curious whether someone has thought or written about some very specific subject, like, AI and cocktails, chances are you're way late to the party. And boy, am I glad to be so late to this whole party, because it gave me the excuse to reach out to our guest for these here AI episodes, Rob Nestor.
Well, my name is Rob Nestor.
Rob is the creator of the podcast Drinking with Robots. It's a show where human bartenders are pitted against AI large language models and challenged to create original cocktails based on specially themed prompts. But Rob's interest in cocktails far predates the rise of ChatGPT.
The way I got into cocktails, my wife and I were actually living in Boston in the mid-aughts during that period of the resurgence of craft cocktails going on in like New York and stuff like that at the time, early aughts. And I remember walking into a place in Brighton called Deep Ellum. It was my first like craft cocktail spot. You walk in, everybody's got the leather aprons, they've got the the sleeve suspenders, everything's made in house. They had the fancy mustaches and everything too. So it was very kind of an era. But the thing that I realized was the care and the consideration that went into the cocktails that were being made there far outstripped what I was accustomed to prior to that, which was, either something simple like a Jack and Coke or, of the era when I started drinking. It was like, oh, how many things can you pack in here and how blue can you make this cocktail?
Now, it's one thing to have an eye-opening experience at a cutting-edge cocktail bar, but there's a couple other professional choices that led Rob down this rabbit hole of AI mixology.
So in the intervening years since living in Boston, I ended up falling into the job that I have now as a day job, which is I'm a software engineer. So day to day talking about coding and creating software. Obviously, one of the things that's been huge on our radar for a long time was machine learning, which kind of morphed into AI. The other job that I have is I am co-owner of a bitters company along with my wife. Quick plug on that, Remedy Cocktail Company.
So we've got a software developer with an interest in machine learning and AI, and this software developer just so happened to own a bitters company. Then, one fateful night, lightning struck.
I remember sitting one night and wondering, how crazy can this thing get? Can it synthesize stuff? Can it do more than just give me, rote informational feedback? And I gave it a prompt, give me a cocktail recipe that Benjamin Franklin would have served Thomas Jefferson after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Weird, right? Just completely random, esoteric. And it shot me back a cocktail recipe that was period correct. It was a punch, very popular of the era.
But here's the thing. ChatGPT didn't just spit out a list of ingredients. It rendered a thoughtful and, as Rob just mentioned, period appropriate drink spec. And then, like any human bartender would after inventing an original cocktail, it gave it a name.
It was something like the Liberty Bell Punch or something, and just to kind of put it all together, I was like, oh, okay. Let's see what else we can do. And so I remember kind of being giddy and talking to my wife about this, and she was like, you should do something with this.
Because there's not currently a ton of existing models for competition shows where humans face off against AI in the culinary or cocktail world, Rob had to get a little creative with the way he set up his show.
Obviously, if it was just a podcast where I had AI make a cocktail, that's kind of boring. So we wanted to bring in a competition element to it. And so the way our show is structured is that for every episode, I come up with a theme, and they are random themes. Sometimes we've gone everything from the international labor movement to the history of the drive-in movie theater. It's whatever I want to do. It's kind of the perk of having your own podcast. But for the first part of the podcast, we do kind of an informational background kind of thing. Give you a little bit of context for whatever the subject is. From there, I tease out a cocktail creation prompt. That prompt then gets sent to a real life human bartender and ChatGPT or whichever AI we're using.
Once the human bartender receives the prompt, they have a week to craft and submit a cocktail spec to Rob. ChatGPT, of course, usually produces something immediately, and as long as it doesn't completely whiff on the prompt, basically as long as it comes up with something that's an actual cocktail, it's on to phase 2 of the show.
Those 2 specs are made by me blind for my wife, the other half of, our bitters company who has the palate.
The AI cocktail and the human-generated cocktail are then assessed using an existing rubric. This is the sort of thing that judges would use in a cocktail competition, and it generally includes rating scales for traits like balance, creativity, and, in this case, how well it fulfills the prompt.
And then we bring in the bartender for a little interview segment, talk about the topic, talk about them, and then they find out in the moment whether they have won or lost against an AI.
If you spent any time working with AI, you know that it can be well or poorly suited to different kinds of tasks. Personally, I use Midjourney to create a lot of the episode artwork for the Modern Bar Cart podcast, including this episode, and sometimes I'm blown away by how poorly it generates objects like bottles, for example. Here's some of the things that Rob has learned about better and worse ways to prompt ChatGPT if you want it to produce genuinely interesting original cocktails.
If you pull up ChatGPT and just say, make me a cocktail with X, Y, and Z ingredients, it will give you a cocktail with X, Y, and Z ingredients, and it's going to probably not be very good. It'll be palatable, but it's not good.
But when you give ChatGPT a prompt like this...
Acting as a cocktail bartender with over 20 years of experience, craft me a cocktail that meets the following requirements. It produces something very different. The other thing that we've discovered is that if you really want an inventive cocktail, don't name ingredients in the prompt. When you tell ChatGPT, make me a cocktail that is evocative of drive-in movie theaters and include, think about the flavors of a drive-in movie theater like chocolate or peanuts or popcorn or soda, you will get a cocktail that contains chocolate and peanuts and popcorn and soda.
The thing to keep in mind about interacting with LLMs, or even in my experience, AI image software, is that the human issuing the prompts often needs to creatively steer the AI in the direction of the outcome they want. So if you hit a wall with one kind of prompt, sometimes you need to back way out and come at the topic from a different angle entirely. In this case, treating the AI more like an actual bartender seems to generate much more interesting and useful outputs.
See, we want to treat it like it's a competitor. We want it to be inventive and novel and creative. And so we actually give it less specificity and we see a better result for our purpose.
This prompted me to ask Rob what he thought might go on in the mind of a bartender versus in the computer brain of a large language model when you ask it to come up with a cocktail given some basic parameters.
So I think in both cases, they are immediately looking at what requirements are there. Are there any like hard and fast requirements? From there, I think both sides look at the concept of like flavor affinities. Any bartender will kind of go, okay, well, maybe I want to do this base because it makes me think of X, related to the prompt. And then if I'm using rum as my base, what flavors are generally, paired with rum, or what's something that I've seen done that works that's unusual, and the data set question, I think, is really what this speaks to in a way. I'll say your typical bartender has kind of a few different data sets of knowledge, right? They've got the stuff that they've gleaned from reading like Means or, Liquid Intelligence or whatever they've been through, right? They've got the knowledge that they've garnered from just being on their feet behind a bar, hopefully being able to work with someone, who's got kind of that institutional knowledge and things like that. And then they have to synthesize those together to produce a working body of knowledge, right? And they can draw from all aspects of that, so that somebody comes in, and they want something that is kind of requires some technical proficiency. Hopefully they've gotten that from either, they're on the kind of on the feet training, or, they remember that one chapter in that one book that they read where it talked about, the way to do the perfect foam, or, whatever it may be. ChatGPT does a really good job of the empirical knowledge, the knowing that X goes with Y because they've seen that in their data set. And in fact, sometimes it has a more robust understanding of flavor pairing than the human bartender.
So AI draws exclusively from a body of written knowledge about cocktails. That's its data set. And that body of knowledge is so vast that the AI can use its pattern recognition superpowers to identify trends and make extrapolations that, for the most part, turn out to be somewhat correct. Imagine a Rain Man-like savant who's read every cocktail book in existence and can instantly average every margarita recipe ever published. That's kind of what we're dealing with. But when it comes to human bartenders, it's not just about ounces and milliliters in books and online articles. What Rob calls institutional knowledge isn't really a set of rules and maxims handed down by an institution. It's the little intuitive moves and tricks that are learned by feeling and experience. It's those few drops of saline solution in the daiquiri. It's noticing a guest has just walked in the door without losing your stir count. It's knowing when a guest can handle something new and exciting and when they just want the same martini they've ordered every Friday for a decade. As humans, we understand how powerful this kind of soft knowledge can be, but don't be so quick to discount what AI can do. After all, those sterile ounces and milliliters in cocktail recipe books wouldn't have been published if some human at some point didn't put that drink in their mouth and say, "Yum." Those recipes that ChatGPT draws from were, in most cases, created by expert bartenders who possessed that kind of soft, institutional knowledge. And they were tweaked and perfected based on actual human sensory feedback. This brings us to a key nuance about AI that I think really bears considering. Artificial intelligence is actually human intelligence in an artificial substrate. Think about it this way. When vegetables are grown indoors with completely artificial light instead of natural sun, with their roots sunk into a substrate of nutrient-adjusted water rather than real dirt, they produce edible byproducts that we call tomatoes, or lettuce, or peppers. It turns out, as long as you have certain basic sets of necessary building blocks, you can take something, whether that thing is a vegetable or a working knowledge of cocktails, and have it take root and flourish in a different substrate altogether, in a different context. And by the way, sometimes that new set of conditions actually allows for more efficient or effective outcomes. Vegetables grown indoors aren't subject to nearly the same kinds of climactic, pest, or disease-related pressures compared to those grown outdoors. And you know what? AI bartenders don't present with nearly the same sort of confounding side effects when compared to human bartenders. No offense, human bartenders, but ChatGPT didn't just work a Clopen shift, rip through an entire Joule pod, and then drink Fernet all night. But this is all hypothetical. How well did the AI and human bartenders actually fare in the first season of Drinking with Robots?
Early on, when the first few episodes were done, before like most of my guests subsequently had a chance to kind of listen to the show, I think there was this, oh, I mean, come on, this is gonna be easy. There's no way this AI can beat me. It's gonna spit out, the lamest riff on an old fashioned ever. It was kind of the mindset probably. I think that for the most part, the bartenders have been great sports about it. And it's interesting because, looking back over season one, if every episode was scored with the rubric that we ended up with, so like I said, our first couple of episodes handled a little differently, we were looking at about a 60-40 split on, the AI winning about 40% of the time.
So for now, human bartenders seem to still have a slight edge on the AI. But wait till you hear what happened during a live Drinking with Robots event, one where the human bartenders didn't have a full week to prep.
We did a competition kind of in between seasons where I brought in 7 of the contestants from season 1 and actually leveraged ChatGPT to structure the competition because I didn't want bartender versus bartender because that doesn't really do anything in our context. So the structure was that we started out with our 7 human subjects and AI, and we had a 3-judge panel. And so we split the first round into 2 groups, but each group got an AI cocktail. We averaged the AI cocktail score. That became the barrier to move on. And so we were anticipating, we'll lose half the field, right? So we'll cut it down to 4 and then 2 and then 1, right? Super easy. Totally the way we planned on having this go. 2 people survived round 1.
Think about that for a second. In the moment, without that 7-day R&D period that folks normally get on Drinking with Robots, the AI managed to drop 5 out of 7 human competitors, increasing its effectiveness from 40% to 70%. Does this mean that we're headed for a future with actual AI bartenders? Will human technicians and liquid artisans be gradually replaced with chatbots who take your order and robots that assemble your drink based on specs generated by a digital ghost in the machine? These are questions that will have to hang in the clouds until part 2, where I continue to mine Rob's expertise about slightly thornier questions like whether or not LLMs possess the ability to surprise and delight the human palate.
I don't know that the AI necessarily has a concept of surprising me or not. It's surprised me a few times with its ingredient selection. Like there are moments where I've been like, really?
We'll also delve into the more practical aspects of deploying AI in a cocktail bar setting, especially the key questions that ChatGPT doesn't know to ask.
Well, how much can I pack in this cocktail? Yeah, do I even consider bottle touches in this? Could I make this on a volume night?
Until then, I hope you'll subscribe to Drinking with Robots wherever you get your podcasts. It's one of my favorite things to listen to. They recently launched season 2, where Rob is joined by his new co-host, Ingrid Folkers, who's a very talented bartender in her own right. I would simply invite you to explore their episode backlog, but if you're looking for one that's a certified banger, definitely check out the episode that featured friend of the podcast, John Mateer, which went live on their feed on December 4th, 2024. It's like the 2nd or 3rd episode of season 2. I look forward to rounding out this 2-part AI cocktail investigation with you very soon. But in the meantime, please remember to drink responsibly and experiment boldly. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a couple things you can do to help the show. One would be to rate and review this program anywhere you enjoy listening to podcasts, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it will be for other like-minded flavor nerds to enjoy the content that I produce. You can also follow the Modern Bar Cart YouTube channel, where I post video clips from the podcast and beyond, and you can join our growing Discord community, which is where our listeners submit questions for upcoming guests and chat about all kinds of fun spirits and cocktail shenanigans. It's also where I share fun perks and discounts that are too exclusive to blast out on the airwaves. To join our community Discord server or get in touch with me for any other reason, all you need to do is drop me a line by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and boozy adventures are just beginning. So remember, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and sound design by Samantha Reed, AI, large language model, and cocktail competition insights courtesy of Rob Nestor, creator of the hit podcast Drinking with Robots, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Direct Fire Studios production, copyright 2024.